There it is. The block is back from the machine shop. All the bores are honed, deck's surfaced. Danny touched up the lifter bores too for me. Everything's clean. All the cam roller bearings are in. And it's been line bored. What else? Oh, fixed our hole in the block down here. Got our certified JB weld, not holding the patch on, but it's tapped or screwed and tapped into the pan rail there, into the block, and it's sealed inside and outside. So shouldn't have any problem with it. It's not structural. It's just holding in vacuum and oil. So let's get to putting the crankshaft in this thing. I maybe forgot to cover the new crankshaft that we got for it. This is a Bryant Racing 3255-inch stroke crankshaft. It's actually about 5 thousandths longer in stroke than what was in it. 250 Ford main bearing size and inch 850 Honda rod journal size. You can see it's center drilled. There's actually a plug. That's an aluminum plug. You can't see this one, but there's plugs in each of these holes to divide the crankcase bays for vacuum, which we're not going to be pulling vacuum on 2 cylinders individually, but they are there. So yeah, pretty nice looking crank. A little bit different looking than the one that came out of it, but still just, I actually didn't weigh them as far as weight difference. But this one is balanced to our rods and pistons. So get some bearing lube on and drop this thing in the block. So what you saw me do there was untorque that number 3 main cap and then give the crankshaft a firm smack to the rear and then forward. And now we've got our dial indicator set up here because we're going to check our crankshaft end play. And that beating back and forth was setting our number 3 thrust bearing. So I need to zero my indicator and get a measurement here. So with our indicator on 0, start at 0 and move the crank, take a long screwdriver or pry bar against the counterweight. You should move it back and we've got about 6 to 7 thousandths there, which is about where we want to be. So crankshaft end plays good. Gonna get to filing some rings and starting to assemble a short block. Okay, crankshaft's in. Spins freely. We got also got the seal on the back here. 100 foot-pounds on the inners, 65 foot-pounds on the outers, and the cross bolts. And we actually measured, or I measured the bearing clearance before all of this was put together, and we're right about 2 8/10 on each of them, between 2 8/10 and 3 thou on all of them. So next step is put some pistons and rods in this thing. So I did all the ring filing last night. I don't know, there wasn't a whole lot to see there, so I didn't actually video any of it, but got all the rings filed and fit to each bore. 21 thousandths gap on the top rings, 25 on the seconds, and then just 15 thousandths minimum on the oils, which none of those needed filing. So we will get piston or rings put on pistons, and hopefully the rods will be here soon. Okay, so it's now a couple weeks later, and as you can see, I finally have some parts. My connecting rods showed up, or went and got the connecting rods. I have 2 assembled cylinder heads, different intake manifold to try out, and I got, this was one thing I've been waiting on, is this cam thrust washer, the rear thrust washer for the camshaft. I'll show you how that goes on there here in a bit. But got the block all cleaned, crankshaft is in, parts here are cleaned, and we are all measured up. Actually got all of our pairings with our clearances here, paired to pistons, paired them to each cylinder to get the clearance right, and get the mass as close as I could on all cylinders. So we are actually ready to start assembling. So let's get to it. So one of the first things we got to do is get the circlip put into one of our grooves on our piston, which is in the pin bore there. So we can put a wrist pin in and put a connecting rod on this piston so we can check the fitment on the big ends. I've already measured the clearance for the journal, between the journal and the housing, but we have to measure the side clearance between the rods and make sure they don't bind, because these are, it's what they call top guided or piston guided. So it means the piston is actually guiding the rod as it comes down the cylinder, not on the big end like in a conventional small block Chevy or Mopar or whatever. So we have to check clearance between the big ends, between the flanks of these big ends, to make sure that they don't bind. So we're going to do that quick before we get all carried away on assembling rings and putting both pin locks in. So here we go. Okay, so what we're up against now, I got 2 rods assembled with the pistons on them, number 7 and 8. And I got them onto the journal. They're snug down, they're not technically torqued yet. But what we're running into, so when the piston is guiding the rod, this rod has to have clearance to float freely on the rod journal. And so what you're looking for, or what I was running into, is when I spread those apart and then you roll it over once. See, we do have, if the camera will focus, we do have a slight amount of clearance there, and I measured about 20 thousandths, which is what you want. But before, I actually they were touching, and you don't want them, when you roll the engine over, you don't want them forcing themselves into each other, or one pushing the other one around, because otherwise they're going to bind up. So what I did, well, when I was running into it when they were together, I actually chamfered the edge of the bearings that are in there, and because it was the fillet radius of the crankshaft was pushing this rod into the other one and vice versa. So I chamfered those bearings, and that is what solved that issue. So I'm probably going to have to do that on the rest of these. It's a little bit time consuming, but I've got kind of this fixture set up. 3D printed a fixture, mocked it up in the lathe, and this one is, I printed it too thin and it's screwed up, so I got to actually print another one because it's getting out of round. But so that's what we're up against. So yeah, gonna do that on all the rest of these, and we'll be setting. I've been having to set the small end clearance too, because a lot of these are actually really tight. They're probably 2 or 3 thousandths, and they need to be about 5 to 6. And also, before I forget to mention it, kind of the rule of thumb for clearance for top guided rods is 30, 30, and 30. So 30 thousandths clearance this side, 30 thousandths in the middle, 30 thousandths in the on the other cheek side. So if you spread these apart, you should have about 90 in the middle, like fully spread apart, which we do. So, and then when you roll the engine over once, you should have about 20. You should be able to stick a 20 thousandths feeler gauge in the center. So that's how I was told to do it, and that's what we're going to do. So what we're doing to achieve this extra side clearance, this is my jig that I've got set up. This is just a hose clamp clamping it to my little fixture. There's 2 halves of the rod bearing there. Then we're just putting a 45-degree chamfer around the one edge, so that sits against the cheek of the crank to kind of offset the fillet radius that's there, so they don't contact. So that's what we're doing. So we got all the bearings chamfered, and I got actually all the rings, pins, rods, everything put together, and short block is almost together. So I'm going to start torquing stuff down. And I actually I've had a few questions on what plastic gauge is. When if you can see it, it's this red stuff right here. I went to the auto parts store and I actually had a special order plastic gauge. So what it is it's just a little wax hair, basically, that you stick across the bearing, torque your cap on, and then it, as the bearing cap torques down, it spreads out, and depending on how much it spreads out, you use this little gauge to see, how much clearance you actually have between the two. If you can kind of see that, we've got about 2 thousandths, which is what we want. So just thought I'd explain that real quick, because I actually had more questions on what plastic gauge was from the auto parts store employees when I was trying to buy it. So that's what plastic gauge is. So we're going to get all these rod caps torqued, and short block, or the bottom end, will be done, and then we'll go on to put it in the camshaft. So rod bolts are all torqued. Forgot to get any footage of me actually doing that, but basically it's a 10 foot-pounds step, 18 foot-pounds step, and then 65 degrees. And then you got to measure this actual stretch of the bolt. So we got 6 to 7 thousandths of an inch of stretch on all of our rod bolts. So I marked them all, so I know that they're torqued. So now we'll move on to the moving on to the camshaft. We got our cam all cleaned up, and I got my adapter back on here with the thrust washer behind it. Bolts in, Loctited and torqued to 17 foot-pounds. So we'll start putting that in. So now that we've got the camshaft in, we actually have to put the motor plate on and then set the end plate of the camshaft with these shims, which is behind this seal plate. And I just wanted to kind of lay this out to show you the 2 styles of timing housing that goes on these. So this is the Jessel billet front cover that actually replaces this motor plate, or doesn't replace it, but requires a different motor plate with this center section cut out. Just two different ways of doing it. But this is an Arrington plate, and Arrington, I guess, did not use that billet timing cover. So we're going to put this plate on, seal it up, and then check our end play, and then if we have to, adjust it with these shims. So here we go. Before I get carried away with assembling everything else on this engine, I forgot I got to put all these plugs in. So these are all the plugs for the oil galleys and water passages, and basically they're your freeze plugs, but they're all O-ring and with a snap ring on them. And I noticed there's a couple that we can kind of covered up, not really, down here with the motor plate, but I need to put all those in before I forget about them. So we're going to do that real quick. So here's our end plate with all the shims installed. We got, crap, basically 20, which is way too much. We got to cut that in down to about 5. So I have to pop this couple bolts off and pull that cover back off and take a shim out or two. So with our prying it as far back as we can get it, we're at 0. Push it as far forward as we can get it. We're at about 4.5. We're pretty darn close. 10's the max. 5 is about where we want to be. 3 is about the minimum. So we're where we want to be. So we've got the motor plate on now. It actually took me a couple tries because I forgot to put, there's 3 plugs in behind here that cover the ends of the galleys for the oil that goes to the lifters, and I forgot to put those plugs in, so I had to pop the motor plate back off and put those in. Otherwise we wouldn't have any oil pressure. So but now we got to install a timing gear and get this thing timed, and then I'll put the belt drive on and start finding TDC. So here we go. So I've got our belt drive installed and got the timing marks lined up as close as I can get it with my eyes. But we're going to degree this camshaft just to make sure we've got it in at the right spot. And first, to do that, we need to establish top dead center. So we've got our deck bridge up top here. The engine's somewhere before top dead center, not touching the dial gauge yet. We have that positioned over a flat spot on the piston. That's what we're going to do, is we are going to rotate the engine over until we get the same amount of lift of the piston on either side of top dead center. So we're going to go, so that reads 50. And then come down here and look at our pointer that I have set up. We're at about 59 degrees. So we're going to write that down. And then we're going to repeat the process for the other side. So I'm going to go, now I'm going to go past top dead center, which is right about there. And we're going to go all the way back down. So the pointer's not touching again, but it's back on 0. And then we're going to rotate back up until we get to 50 thousandths. Right there. So now we've got about 94 degrees. So we're going to take 94 and 59, and average the two, and then we will have our top dead center. So as you might have guessed, I had already figured that out with the tape that was sitting right here. And I placed the tape up here on with the edge of the tape at about 76.5 degrees. So now that we've got top dead center established, we will check our lobe center line by setting up our dial indicator on the lifter. Okay, so now that we've got our dial indicator set up on our lifter, you want to make sure that you've got that the push rod is in line with the travel of the lifter, and I try to make sure it's not actually resting on the side of the lifter, just so it's not bound up by anything. You also want to make sure that you're on the base circle of the camshaft, and then set a little bit of preload on your dial indicator, so that way the lifter doesn't come all the way, or the dial indicator doesn't come all the way down and then stop at 0, and then your lifter keep going down and you're not measuring anything. So just something that I had happen and you need to be cognizant of. So we're before, I rotated the engine back, we're before top dead center quite a ways. We're actually before the camshaft even starts to lift, but so we're going to start with, we've got our dial indicator on 0, and we're going to start rolling it over until we get to 50 thousandths of tappet lift. Right there. And then we go down here and we look, we're about 51 degrees on our pointer, which is about 25 degrees before top dead center. Okay, which is about where we should be. I believe the cam card is 22 degrees before top dead center. So we're going to keep going. So roll it all the way over until we get going back down, and then we're back on 0, so that's the base circle, and then we're going to roll it back counterclockwise until we get to 50. So we're on 50 again there, and we bring our back down here. Pointer's at about 47.5. So we're going to write those two numbers down, but we got to remember that we crossed 180 over here. So this is, because this is 47.5 from 0, this is actually this distance that we need to cover, and then plus this distance. So I will math that out for you here in just a second. Okay. So to go over this, or to wrap this all up, we've got our lifter travel up and down at 50 thousandths on either side of the camshaft lobe. So we're at 51 degrees on the degree wheel and 47.5, which the total travel, since we cross 180, you have to subtract from 180. So total travel up is 129 degrees, total travel down is 132.5 degrees. And then when you add them together, you get 261.5 degrees, which should be right on or very close to your advertised intake duration at 50 thousandths. Or sorry, not advertised, but intake duration at 50 thousandths. advertised is always larger. And which does match. Our cam card that I got from my buddy at Comp was 262 at 50. So we're very close there. And then to find your installed center line, you need to take that total distance traveled and divide it by 2. So we're at 130.75 degrees. Okay. Take 130.75 degrees, add it to your starting point. Then you get 181.75 degrees, which would give you position of the center line on the degree wheel, which would be right here, 181.75-ish. But to get that in relation to top dead center, you have to take, since our top dead center on the degree wheel doesn't match 0, we have to take 181.75 minus our top dead center number, leaves us with 105.25 degrees. That is your intake center line as installed. Advertised intake center line on this, or recommended intake center line, is 109 degrees. So 109 minus 105.25 means we're 3.75 or approximately 4 degrees advanced. So the cam events are happening approximately 4 degrees sooner than they should be. So what we'll do, I've got right up here, you can advance or retard the outer gear on this aluminum hub. So we'll just take these 4 bolts loose, and I'm going to advance this 4 degrees, and then we're going to call that good. So that is, in a nutshell, how to check your installed center line.